Hi, welcome to chapter 15 of History, Framing of the Constitution right after independence, and the process started before independence itself. Let's move forward. What all are we going to cover in this is mentioned here. First is the relevance of this in your exam, especially on the MCQ side. We will talk a little bit about the backdrop, the context in which the Constitution was framed, how did it happen, who were the important people involved in this, what were their views, what were the different perspectives that we had pertaining to critical constituents of the country, the backward people, the scheduled castes, the minorities, the women, the poor. How did the constitution writers, makers go about including all of them and their welfare into the framing of the constitution? We will cover a little bit about the center versus state. It continues to be a real issue. And we will end by talking a little bit about the languages aspect in the constitution. And lastly, what is it and how is it captured, the word secularism, how is it captured in the Indian constitution? Okay, let's move forward. सबसे पहले learning objectives हमने कवर कर लिया है. This is what it is all about. We covered it in the previous slide, and this is the here and now part of it that I'm sure you are very interested in. 3 to 4 questions, a very easy chapter, just a bunch of important names, dates and concepts. Pay attention, and these 4 points are up for grabs for you. A couple of sample questions before we get started. Read it. Whose famous speech was this? That could be a question. The answer is given here. And the questions are going to be as simple as this if you read this chapter. Another sample question. How many members did the Constituent Assembly have when it got constituted? Answer is given here to give you a sense of the questions. Okay? Let's get started. सबसे पहले कॉन्स्टिट्यूएंट असेंबली जब बनाया गया और कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन फ्रेमवर्क करने के लिए इनको काम दिया गया, उस वक्त व्हाट वाज द बैकड्रॉप, व्हाट वाज द कॉन्टेक्स्ट, सिचुएशन क्या था, आपको सबको मालूम है. We've covered it in other chapters as well. You know, the moment the Direct Action Day was announced in March 1946 by the Muslim League in Calcutta, violence broke out, and this violence continued till 1948. So, जैसे हमने कहीं और कवर किया था, 46 to 48, the period of partition should actually more accurately be called the period of civil war. Governments involved नहीं थे order establish करने में. It was self-appointed representatives of different religious groups, cultural groups, geographical groups. They took over. ये बहुत important context था. दूसरा बहुत अहम बात ये है कि on the surface of it there was this Hindu-Muslim tension. Okay? But many historians, many political scientists, they also point out something to us. वो कहते हैं कि Quit India movement में the kind of communal harmony and togetherness that was demonstrated by different communities was exemplary. Hindus, Sikhs, Muslims, Christians, they were all shoulder to shoulder fighting. Okay? Similarly, those who participated in the struggle for independence, it was a little armed struggle anchored by Subhash Bose, वहां पर भी ये देखा गया. And you know, the mutiny that happened in Bombay of the Royal Indian Navy also demonstrated this unity. So while on the surface level there were these vested interests who were driving the communal tension and actually perpetuating it in a very programmatic manner, the underlying theme that many people saw was a lot of harmony. And one interesting, the joker in the pack, usi backdrop mein were these Maharajas. You know, they were almost autonomous. 2/3 of India was direct British provinces, but 1/3 was still under Maharajas. Barodas, Sindhias, Nizams of Hyderabad, Bhopal, Junagadh, etc. These guys were feeling, अच्छा अब तो ब्रिटिश चला जाएगा तो वापस अपने को अपना राजभार संभालने का मौका मिलेगा, हम लोग भी इंडिया से सेपरेट हो जाएंगे. दिस वाज वेरी इंटरेस्टिंग व्यू दैट दे वर होल्डिंग. ठीक है, ये बैकड्रॉप था. देखते हैं इसके आगे बात कैसे बढ़ी. You know, as you are aware, the provincial elections, which had about 12 to 14% of adults franchised, they had the right to vote. Provincial elections हुए थे, आपको मालूम है 1946 में. In these elections, Congress as well as Muslim League captured the majorities in their respective strength areas. So for the first time, Muslim League captured majority in the section B and section C. Western part of India, in Punjab, Sindh, Balochistan, and eastern part of India, which is in and around Bengal and Assam, where there was Muslim majorities, Muslim League got majority, whereas Congress got majorities in the rest of the country. Okay? And from these provincial election results, they picked up representatives and sent them to the Constituent Assembly. So Constituent Assembly के जो पहले 300 members थे, they were not chosen directly by the people of the country, they were representatives chosen after the provincial elections by the provincial assemblies. ठीक है, आगे चलते हैं. Now, in these elections, after the people were sent, two things happened. One, Muslim League boycotted being part of the Constituent Assembly. They said that even if we go there, it's of no use, we won't get our say, so we are boycotting it, we want only partition in the form of Pakistan. वो जो दौर था वो तूल पकड़ चुका था, और 82% of the members in the assembly were Congress people. So it was essentially called as, you know, Congress guys are going to be part of the constitution making. One interesting and very healthy thing though that happened was that every single debate, speech, view that was taken in the parliament, in the Constituent Assembly, got widely covered in the media. And the result of it was, what is the stance that people are taking inside the assembly was known to the common man, at least the learned people, literate people, and many of them were social workers. They went out and spread the message out. And उनका जो response था, आवाम का जो response था, वो भी वापस पहुंच रहा था. So this created a very interesting and healthy cycle of release of the stance, feedback coming back. And this went a long way in affecting the shape of the constitution if you go into the details of it. Okay, that's the making of it. Who were the prominent voices? As you know, Gandhiji was out of it. He never was part of the administration. And Jawaharlal Nehru, Patel and Prasad were the key voices in the making of it. You know, in some sense, the captain of the team was Jawaharlal Nehru. Patel used to work in the backdrop because one of the key things that India wanted to achieve was the integration of all of it into one entity. And constitution framing में इसके लिए appropriate जगह बनाना था, appropriate provisions डालने थे. So Vallabhbhai Patel was in the backdrop, whereas Rajendra Prasad was anchoring the process. कब meeting होगा, कैसे होगा, and all of that. He was anchoring that. While that was happening, in some sense, the draft committee के जो chairman and the in charge and it is considered that the brain behind it was this learned lawyer and freedom fighter, Dr. BR Ambedkar. Okay, a couple of other people, Dr. K. M. Munshi and Krishnaswamy Iyer, not so famous as the other people. Those were other two very important names that were part of the prominent voices in the framing of the Constitution chapter of Indian modern history. ठीक, आगे चलते हैं. याद रखिएगा ये इन नेम्स के बारे में MCQs आ सकते हैं. ठीक है. One of the first things that Jawaharlal Nehru moved right after this formation was to create the objectives resolution. माने ये जो कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन का फ्रेमिंग का इवेंचुअल आउटकम क्या है वो हमको फॉर्मली इनको अप्रूव कराना था. And that is what is captured here. Okay, again it could become an important thing that can be asked in your exam. The objective resolution was to create or the frame the defining ideals of the Constitution, which provided the framework within which the constitution making will proceed. So everybody, all the 300 people has to sign off that framing of the constitution का resolution क्या होगा, इसका outcome क्या होगा. Because you are not writing rules to rule the country for the next 100 years. You are framing the constitution which provides the framework for future governance of the country. Okay, an interesting point, pay attention to it. It took 3 years. The eventual thing was 11 volumes big, and Dr. Ambedkar is credited to be the one who did the maximum heavy lifting in constitution writing, played a very, very central role in that. Okay, let's move forward. What was the vision of the constitution? Some important elements. When you go back and read the chapter, it will make sense. Let's cover the salient points here. Number one, we wanted an independent India that was sovereign, which means in no sense, no way is this country going to be answerable to anybody, and no connections with the British Empire or the Queen. Do read up the definitions of sovereignty and what is difference between being a republic and not being a republic. It could be useful. How do we create the vision of the constitution was extremely preoccupied with this thought that India is a poor country, extremely exploited. Just about 11% of them are literate, poor peasants, workers, downtrodden, illiterate, women, low health scores, HDI was very low. So how do we safeguard the interests of all of these people was to be enshrined in the constitution. Okay, that was an important part of the vision. Then the three things, we'll come back to this at the end of it. You know, Indian constitution did not include the word secular, but it was safeguarded by saying that there is justice that will be guaranteed, there will be equality that will be guaranteed at all costs to everybody, and the third is there is an absolute freedom to every citizen of the country without any discrimination, including voting, which wasn't there even in many or most of the mature democracies at that point in time. Another important guiding radar or compass that they were looking at is, you know, India saw a large number of eminent leaders, social reformers who worked towards eliminating lot of social evils. So एक और बहुत important नजरिया था constitution makers, the founding fathers का, कि इनको हम constitutionally कैसे provide करें कि इनको abolish किया जाए, इनको खत्म किया जाए. Child marriage, remarriage of the widow. You know, the end of Sati happened some time ago, if you remember. Swami Vivekananda spoke about how even the Hindu religion needs to be reformed. How do we create scope for that? How do we take care of the oppressed caste, the depressed caste, the downtrodden? How do we take care of the socialists or the workers? And different groups, different people were working towards this. Constitution wanted to include all of it in its vision-making process from 1946 to 1950. Okay, let's move forward. Now, when the debates began in the Constituent Assembly, there were these 4 different segments. Let's pick each one of those and spend a minute each, जिसके बारे में बहुत intense debates हुए थे. सबसे पहला था about the minorities. And you know, it kind of gets exaggerated, or excess focus comes on Muslims, but it means for all the minorities, the Muslims, the Sikhs, the Parsis, the Isais, the Jains, the Buddhas, and all of them. Okay? So, there was one member from Madras, Pokar Bahadur. His speech on 27th August 1947 is one of the well referred speeches for the next few decades, and he spoke about why the separate electorate must continue for Muslims. Okay? उन्होंने कहा था ये अलग अलग होना चाहिए, whereas lot of other people, senior leaders said that no, don't create this, इससे दरारें और बढ़ेंगी. Debate was, should the separate electorate continue or should it be ended? And interestingly, not all Muslims were in favor of this. आप सोचेंगे कि ये जो argument है, maybe Muslims would be in favor and Sikhs or Isais or Parsis or Hindus would be against it. That wasn't the case, very interestingly. Because the argument also was that if you do it for Muslims, what about others? What about this group? What about that group? और कहाँ तक इसको आप slice करते चले जाओगे? So eventually what happened was, it was agreed that this kind of an approach actually is self-destructive. Instead of forming bonds, it will separate people, it isolates group from one another. So India as a country took a very wise decision of doing away with this. There were other ways, other mechanisms by which reserved constituencies, etc. are practiced in India. We will cover that elsewhere, but separate electorates based on religious identity was done away with. Very important part. You must keep this as an important part of the chapter. The second one, Professor Injiranga had worked for the poor and the downtrodden all his life. He was a Gandhian who dedicated his life for the Indian independence, but also for the emancipation of the poor. And he said that the real minorities are not the religious minorities. Don't look at it like that. He said the real minorities of the country are those who are economically backward, who are left backward because they haven't got access to education. And he fought very hard in the constitution framing for these people, and a lot of it got enshrined. And all of this, zamindari system in India got abolished. If you remember, in some other chapter we covered this, saying that the reason why Congress and Muslim League did not come into a coalition in United Provinces was because Congress wanted to abolish zamindari system. Congress wanted to do away with this. It was informal, but bonded labor was very real. You would have seen, or if you go back and watch some movies of 50s and even up till 60s, there are these poor and downtrodden zamindar के lands के बाहर पड़े रहते हैं, and generation after generation they are serving the zamindar. All of these reforms happened due to efforts in the constitution framing and led by many people, including Professor Injiranga. And as I said, this is what he said: the real minority are the weak and the poor. Okay, so we've covered the religious group, separate electorate as one segment. We've covered the economically backward. Let's move forward and talk about the caste-based system and what it had done to India in the previous 200, 300, 500 years. And all of this, lot of degeneration of practices had happened. And people like Raja Ram Mohan Rai, Swami Vivekananda, Dr. BR Ambedkar, large number of people had worked on it in the previous 100 years. And in constitution framing, this was addressed. And one of the speeches again is of one Jaipal Singh. He spoke very passionately. You can read up about it. And one of the things that he said while speaking on behalf of all the members who are fighting for this is that ऐसा नहीं है कि ये लोग numerically, the Adivasis, the backward castes, the origin, in that sense, the original Indian Adivasis, who you can trace them. Even today, if you go to Andaman Nicobar Islands, there are some Adivasis who are not touched by modern technology. And those people were there in India for large parts of the 19th century and early 20th century also. They said that it is not that they are numerically small. They comprise 25% of India's population. However, they were systematically marginalized. They did not get access. There were no reforms. There were no efforts by the government to go and bring them up to speed with where the world is headed. And lack of education led to no role in the society, in the administration as the world progressed. तो उन्होंने कहा कि हमको इसके बारे में सोचना चाहिए, कॉन्स्टिट्यूशन फ्रेमिंग में इसको डील करने के लिए, इसका इलाज करने के लिए स्टेप्स लेने चाहिए. And the champion of this amongst many people in the framing of the constitution was Dr. BR Ambedkar as well. But very interesting thing, there was a time when Dr. BR Ambedkar, up till 1930s, up till 1945, he was a votary, he was a supporter of having a separate electorate for the backward classes. But very interestingly, and this talks about the wisdom of this man, when he saw the separate electorate conversation based on religious identity leading to complete disruption of communal harmony, he gave up the demand after the partition and said, no, I'm making a shift. We should not erect more walls by talking about separate electorate for the castes or the oppressed sections of the society. You must integrate them, give them rights. Why can they not be on top of the pyramid, and why should any crumbs be thrown at them? Okay, let's move forward. Women, one of the phenomenally important things about not just India but entire South Asia is the role of women at very early stages of their becoming independent, very early stage. Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister in 1966. Similarly, Sirimao Bandaranaike in Sri Lanka, Khalida Zia, Bangladesh, Benazir Bhutto, Pakistan. And this happened 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago. Within 20 years of becoming independent, Indira Gandhi became the Prime Minister. So one of the things that you will observe is, while that is not the case even in the US after 250 years, not a single women Prime Minister. So one of the reasons for that is, India at the constitution making gave women exactly the same rights as men. They said that it doesn't matter. She might be illiterate, but she is not unwise. These are two different things. जिंदगी की समझ है और उनको हमको पूरा हक देना चाहिए जाकर अपने नुमाइंदे को, अपने रिप्रेजेंटेटिव को चुनने की वो सलाहियत रखती है. And those position, those movement, those debates were led by many eminent people, including Hansa Mehta, Sarojini Naidu, Vijayalakshmi Pandit, and so on. Okay? Voting rights for women. And very interestingly, these women said that don't give us concessions. Just treat us at par with men. And that's what Indian Constitution has done. So if there is any discrimination against women, it is an unconstitutional act done by anybody who's doing it. ठीक है? Let's keep moving. Constitution has happened. One of the last chapters of Constitution was about how do we deal with center or union versus state. For example, even Pandit Nehru was extremely keen for a very strong center, and he was supported by a few senior leaders including Sardar Patel, because we were dealing with some very challenging issues at that point in time, and their worry was if we weaken the union and strengthen the states, ऐसा ना हो कि they start seceding, they start moving away, and the entire country just goes asunder. Okay? The debate in the parliament also had people who had a very different view and who said that, giving away lot of powers to the states doesn't mean you become weak, it actually means that you feel strong about it. That entire debate led to subjects being split into 3 lists called the union list, the state list and the concurrent list, which means कौन सा सब्जेक्ट किसके दायरे में आता है, who is the boss. For example, all of defense comes under union list. All of land which is locally held or sales that happens locally, it comes under the state list. And there are some things like education, for example, that come in the concurrent list. Concurrent list means it applies to, and there is a say, there is a role for both the state government and the union government. One additional feature was put in called that if there is a crisis, if there is an administrative breakdown for any reason, they created something called as an Article 356, in which case the central government or the union government can dismiss the elected state government and take over the administration. It is considered not a good thing to happen, but there are times when this has happened, and the first time this was applied was by Jawaharlal Nehru himself. We covered it in some other chapter, I'll skip that here. Now, where do the monies come from? What resources belongs to whom? This was obviously covered in this part of the Constitution, and things like the customs duty, the corporate taxes, that all of those belongs to the center, whereas land related taxes, sales taxes, property estate related taxes belongs entirely to the state. And then there is money, taxes that are coming from your excise and income tax, that is shared between the center and the state in a certain ratio based on certain formula. Okay? So center and state में अगर आप इसका निचोड़ निकालेंगे, so ये argue कर सकते हैं आप as a student of political science and history that there was a little bit of a bias towards the union and away from the state in the making of the Constitution. Okay? And as we proceeded in the last 75 years, there were amendments that have happened which tried to restore a little bit of a greater balance towards the middle. But at the time of Constitution framing, this is something that you must keep in mind, and this itself could be a true or false kind of a question for you. Take? Keep moving. Another big controversial point that was there at that time, and that has continued, and that is again live with one comment that film star Ajay Devgan made a few weeks ago, which is about the language of the nation. There was a debate about declaring one particular language as a national language. Gandhiji wanted this to be Hindustani. You know, Hindustani was where it's not pure Hindi, it's not pure Urdu, it's not pure Sanskrit. Hindustani was the language spoken on the streets of India, which had lots of imports from various languages. It came from Awadhi, it came from Maithili, it came from Persian, it came from Turkish, it came from Sanskrit. And he said that that one should be or could be the official language. So इस डिबेट में सबसे पहले नेशनल लैंग्वेज कुछ है करके उसको हटा दिया गया. उन्होंने कहा कि नहीं, कोई नेशनल लैंग्वेज नहीं है, ऑफिशियल लैंग्वेजेस हाँ बिल्कुल होंगे और कई सारे होंगे. ओके, एंड after a lot of debate, these two got eliminated and Hindi became one of the official languages along all the leading languages of India, whether it is Tamil, Telugu, Assamese, Bangla, Marathi, and so on. Okay, and that we are going to use English for an official purpose for the next 15 years was formally adopted. Of course, it continues to this day, but if you go to different states, each state has its own official language and the files and the documentation is done in that language as well, along with English, because then it can travel across the country. It also gets done in Hindi in significant parts of the country. Language के issue का बहुत गहरा असर होता है local population के ऊपर. You know, there is a saying that language is a threshold to a culture. If you want to demolish or destroy a culture, you start discriminating or ending the use of that language. Because अगर बच्चे को संस्कृत पढ़ना नहीं आता, तो वो रामायण संस्कृत में वाल्मीकि ने लिखा है तो वो कैसे जानेगा? या if Tamil goes out of fashion or Punjabi is not spoken in Punjab as a country, if kids are not taught that in school. So when Hindi was being pushed during the initial days, there was a tremendous pushback led by, as we've covered in some other chapter, led most prominently by the Dravidian movement from Tamil Nadu. There was a very violent push, and it was supported all across the country by people who thought that the domination of one language will actually kill the culture and it will diminish our identity, and that will be very detrimental to the long-term future of our region, of our culture. Very rightly so, but this got accommodated thankfully, and we as a country have progressed, and very comfortable as a country we are with multiple languages, and kids, any kid in India, any child, any student is comfortable speaking 2, 3, 4, 5 languages depending upon which city he is growing up in or she is growing up in. Very interesting, very important and very fascinating part of India's journey after independence. One exceptional feature while we get to the close of this session about the Indian Constitution was, I have mentioned it earlier also, every adult gets a voting right, done on day one. I think our founding fathers deserve tremendous amount of credit for doing this, and अगर आप उसको mature democracy से भी cover करते हैं तो आपको ताज्जुब होगा कि for a long period of time, even in Western Europe, including UK, and in North America, including US, शुरू में उन्हीं लोगों को वोटिंग का राइट था जिनके पास लैंड था, जो प्रॉपर्टी ओन करते थे. जो प्रॉपर्टीलेस वर्कर है, he did not have any say in the government formation. Sounds very funny, right? Similarly, at another stage, it was available only for those who had certain amount of literacy. Women did not have rights for long into the future. When India had given rights to women, most parts of Western Europe had not yet given rights to the women in democracies. This is one phenomenally forward-looking step that India took on day one, and you and I as citizens of this country, not just as students of political science or modern history, we must be aware of it and keep this in mind when we study the way India has progressed. Last is the whole story about secularism. You know, the way India dealt with secularism, again I think it needs tremendous amount of credit. They said that you will have freedom of religion. There was no mention explicitly of the word secularism. Okay? They said you have a freedom of religion. You have freedom of your culture. एंड रिलीजियन को और कल्चर को अलग करके देखा गया. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, द वे पंजाबी हिंदू and a Punjabi Muslim, they lived together before partition, is exemplary. Culturally they were Punjabis, ethnically they were Punjabis, but religion wise he practices Islam and she practices Hinduism or Christianity for that matter. Okay. Right to education. Nobody can be denied education based on any tag other than being a citizen or a person. Right to equality. So India dealt with secularism just as it dealt with many subjects by addressing something even more core and not lift it at a surface. Okay. And the way India deals with religion as a country is not by separation of state from religion. It is not agnostic like China or Russia. They deny existence of religion. They're not, कोई वास्ता नहीं उसके साथ. ऐसा नहीं करता है इंडिया. India practices judicious distance from all religions. But I'm close to this, I'm close to this. If I'm far from this, I'm far from this. A very important and very wise part of our constitution making comes from language as well as secularism. We finish the chapter. Let's quickly take a look at a few questions before we finish it. There are sample questions that I've put together. Go back, finish your chapter, read it once before you take the practice exercise. Indian Constitution came into force when? Who among the following was the chairman of the drafting committee? As you can see, I've ticked the answers also, just for the sake of making you know it. Okay? Dr. Ambedkar. As per Mahatma Gandhi, which of these should have been Hindustani? It is not. It's now not even called as a separate language. Okay. How many people were there in the Constituent Assembly? Elected and sent. Okay. That brings us to the end of this session. Have fun reading it. It's a very important chapter. 4 marks to be taken, and not much expanse. A bunch of names, a bunch of events, and a bunch of dates. That's it. Okay. Thank you very much. Take care. I'm going to see you again live in some other session soon. Bye-bye.